Hannah, I need to get things on the wall. So hopefully for our next Zoom Torah study, you'll see a little bit more behind me. And it'll be a little bit warmer in here than it is right now. But for now, I apologize. You have to just look at my white walls.
No problem.
Okay, I am going to share my screen, and as other folks join, we'll just continue. Okay.
And I'm going to try to get myself off the screen.
Okay. So
I'm very bad with this.
Can everyone see my screen with the source sheet on it?
Yes, can you make it a little larger?
Ruth,
Yes, I can.
how can I get off the screen?
Good, better.
That's better.
That's better? Okay, yeah, does anybody want it larger? No, we're good? Okay,
This is
great.
okay, but if you can make it a little larger, that's good too, I guess.
Okay, great. I will make it a little larger.
They're also single space too, so, okay, good, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's great to be with all of you here today, and I'm looking forward to this being the first of many Zoom Torah studies together. I'm Rabbi Leah Fein. I just started like 2.5, 3 weeks ago at Wilshire, and I'm very grateful to be here. Those who I got to meet during my interview a few months ago, I might have shared that I grew up at Wilshire, and my family has been members here for generations. So I grew up, sitting in high holiday services with my parents and grandparents and great grandmothers in the sanctuary at Glazer, and did a teen program during high school at the Irmis campus, and now to have an office on the same campus where I did a high school program, and to be part of this community as a rabbi feels very, very special. So I really thank you all for having me and for welcoming me. And learning is one of my favorite things to do, and I'm the kind of person who gets so much more out of what I learn based on conversations with others and based on the perspectives of others. So I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives today on this little bit of our Parsha that we are going to be looking at. So I'll invite you, please participate. If you have any questions or comments, throw it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself. And I hope that this becomes a really nice and generative conversation. So our Parsha for this week is Parshat Matot-Masei. It's a double Parsha. And this Parsha is what ends the book of Numbers. So just to give us a little bit of context before we jump into the text itself, at the end of the book of Numbers, the Israelites find themselves on the banks of the Jordan River about to enter the promised land. So they have fully journeyed, and here they are. And then the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll begin next week, is really just Moses' retelling of their journey. And so the book of Numbers actually culminates their journey in a really beautiful way. And elsewhere in the Parsha, the Torah details the entire journey that the Israelites have taken in the wilderness. God says to them, you stopped here, you complained there, we had water here, this is what happened in this place, this is where this battle took place. And so this Parsha is, both new in a lot of ways, but also a way of looking back for the Israelites and a way of looking forward to what is about to come as they're about to enter the promised land. So that's the context that we are coming into today. And the part of the Parsha I am really interested in this week is something very small, but something that our rabbis take in so many different ways, which is the concept of the cities of refuge. So have we learned about this together as a group yet? Yes. Okay, great. Amazing. So I'm looking forward to like hearing what people take from this conversation and bringing in what you've been learning in the past as well. So as many of you know, the context of the cities of refuge is that in the ancient Near East, it was common practice for people to avenge the killing of a family member. And because of that common practice, the Torah felt the need to create laws around what would happen in the case of an accidental killing when the killer did not do this intentionally. And at the same time, the person who was killed, their family members have this obligation to avenge their death, no matter what. So that is the context of the cities of refuge. So we're going to read a little bit about it, and then there's one piece of text that I want to dive into a little bit deeper that I think is a bit peculiar and a bit interesting. And so we're going to look at different commentaries about that one piece. Okay, but first we're going to start with this piece from the Parsha itself. So God tells Moses, tell the Israelites, you shall provide. Oh, yes.
You usually say the bracha beforehand.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Torah. Amen.
Amen. Susan, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, please help out the newbie in any way. Okay, great. Now that we said the bracha, we can dive in. You shall provide yourselves with places to serve you as cities of refuge, to which a manslayer who has killed a person unintentionally may flee. The cities shall serve you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer may not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly. The towns that you thus assign shall be 6 cities of refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. The assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled. And there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who is anointed with the sacred oil. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I myself abide, for I, the Lord, abide among the Israelite people. All right, so that's the section we're going to focus on today. I'm curious, as you look at the text, what questions come up for you? What questions do you have either about the text itself, words, phrases, or any of the intentions behind it? What questions come up? David.
Does it seem to be a contradiction at the end that there's a very clear set of actions you take if someone has accidentally murdered somebody? But then there's this question about polluting the land and who alone can expiate and whose blood. And that seems to be a lot messier and a lot more badly determined than the sort of gracious aspect. Could you address that?
Do you mean that the previous part seems much more straightforward and that the end seems like it could be a lot messier in how it's handled and could be interpreted in a lot of different ways?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So, right. The first part about the killer and the avenger seems to be this very clear cut, not necessarily so clear cut. The rabbis still are figuring out, well, what situations are really what, how can you determine intention, and like all of those kinds of questions certainly come up. But it seems very clear. There is a system of law. There's this assembly, which is, this person is brought to trial in a way that like we don't imagine trial in the exact same way, but like we can imagine what a trial is like for something like this. It is between people, and that seems more clear cut and more straightforward. And then the end, God is brought into it, and the land is brought into it. And when we think about the context of where this is falling in the book of Numbers, the people are on one side of the Jordan about to enter the land, and God has been with them while they've been wandering in the wilderness. They've seen God as this pillar of fire, as this cloud that's been coming with them. And I can imagine a fear of the people. Well, what happens when we enter the land? How do we know that God is with us? How does God show us that? And I can imagine God's fear as well of, I've been with these people and I've shared my laws with them. We've entered into this covenant together. And now, what is another piece of this covenant that's going to be between us once we're collectively in the land? So I think that's such an interesting point that we see this shift from, and we have the same idea in other areas of Jewish life and Jewish law as well, of bein adam lechavero, between two people, like the relationship between two people and the dynamic between two people, and bein adam lemakom, the relationship and dynamic between a person and God. And here we actually have both in a way that we might not expect. And then the land is brought into it too, which is so interesting. Other questions that you see coming up, even if we like can't find answers for them or different interpretations. Yeah, Benjamin.
Thank you, Rabbi. When they refer to pollute the land, are they talking about pollution like we think of it today? Smog and things. And it's interesting, if that's the case, it's interesting that is referenced here in the Torah. I mean, being a steward of the land is such an old concept, but here today we still disagree over whether or not climate change or whatever even exists.
Nice. I'm curious to hear, how did other people read pollution in this context of the land? Susan.
See, I don't see it as polluting, ecologically. I see it as polluting morally. And that seems to be one of God's biggest concerns. And murderers pollute a country morally. So I see that as indicative, and I see it recurring a lot of times when they have evil people in there, and they say they refer to polluting the land. The Israelites is what it is. What always strikes me here is that they're there till the death of the high priest. So so there's then that's kind of questionable because someone might want to kill the high priest so that they can get free. And that's a weird kind of stipulation, I think.
I also find that to be very weird. And I had the same reaction that you did. Like, to me, this is just encouraging the assassination of the high priest, and over and over and over again. Not just once, but every new high priest who comes in. So that does seem very odd to me. I'm curious to hear folks' interpretation of that. And Benjamin, also to address the pollution piece that you and Susan were talking about. Susan, when you said, like we see this concept again, one of the places that my mind immediately goes to with blood polluting the land is the same idea comes up in the Cain and Abel story. That when Cain kills his brother Abel, it's this idea that like the blood is calling out from the land and that the blood has polluted the land. And so there's this there seems to be this direct connection specifically between murder and blood, and that as morally corrupting, morally polluting the land. But Benjamin, I really appreciate what you were saying about, the way that we think about climate and our land and our earth today, and the way that, our actions, like often we think about that as what are our actions toward the earth, what are our actions toward the climate, what are our actions toward the land. And this is saying here, it's about that, but our interactions toward one another and with God all impact the land. And to me, that like broader way of thinking about it, I think is really beautiful, that it's about a relationship that's also much bigger. Yeah, I'm curious to hear, what did other people make of the death of the high priest, being, the moment that somebody who has had to stay in a city of refuge can, finally go free from exile, and, they're protected from the Avenger. Why do people think that's in here? Yeah, David.
I have to unmute myself. It seems to me that it frequently in the Torah, restrictions, for instance, servitude for 7 years, and at the end of 7 years, you're free, that you're in this city for a certain amount of time, but the time ends when the high priest dies. It never occurred to me that someone would try to assassinate the high priest because he's the high priest, right? It's like you don't mess around with the authorities. But authority passes, and as authority passes, your punishment or your restriction is lifted. So it seems to me to my mind, this is kind of another enlightened piece of the Torah, which is nothing lasts forever.
Nice. And it's a very, Jewish idea of, we're coming up to, like, obviously my mind is on high holidays, and the idea of tshuva, that we all have the opportunity to return, to ask for forgiveness, and that is possible down the road, even if it's something that can't be immediate. Other ideas around the high priest? Yeah, Pnina.
All right. I think that it was a very naive way of putting a band-aid on something that we actually experience even today. First of all, if you're giving a set of laws that are meant for the Israelites and the people who join them, it doesn't affect other people who live in the country. They wouldn't see it as a law. And if somebody is already believing in vendetta, whatever you want to call it, and they're not going to go only after the first of kin. They're going to go after anybody in the family or in the community. Right. And we know it from reality today. So I think it was a naive or a hopeful way. And today we have sanctuary cities. Does it work? San Francisco is one of them. Does it work? Nobody wants to go visit there anymore. It's terrible. Anyhow, I think it was a way of bringing a solution, hopefully. But we know today that if the next of kin is not there, they're going to kill somebody else in the family that's not next of kin, so close, or the whole community. So like I said before, I think it was a very naive way of trying to tell them that there is a protection. If it's a mistake and somebody is going to be able to fix it for them, like the high priest, if it was a mistake. But yeah, I think it was just, it was a naive law, and it didn't work, and it's not working today. This is my opinion. And not everything that was given to them to do or not to do was followed exactly. The time tells you that a lot of things change because they didn't work. That was one thing that was suggested and does not work. That's all.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify, like, sanctuary cities today are a little bit different than cities of refuge in the Torah, but it's confusing because, like, the language is so similar too.
That's not that far away. Not that far away.
And Meryl, I saw your hand up as well.
I was just going to say that I think what I get out of this is there's somebody there's always going to be somebody that is mad, is somebody's mad at, and whatever way they can, if they can't get to that person, they'll find somebody else to get to. I can't think of the
Exactly.
right word. There's always going to be an issue. And I think, however long this was written, however long ago this was written, it's still happening today, the blame game. No matter what the situation is. I mean, you could be walking through the grocery store and somebody can cut you off and somebody starts screaming at you.
Right.
I mean, for whatever reason they feel they have to scream at you. I don't think that, as much as I don't want to think about it, I don't think things have changed. And in some ways, verbally, things have gotten worse.
Do you read this and do you think that the punishment of being exiled for an unintentional killer, do you see that as fitting of the crime?
They'll find new friends.
I don't think it's fitting of the crime, it's protection in that case.
An unintentional killing still affects the family. And unless it happens in today's world or in yesterday's world, it never goes away, I think. So that's something that I don't understand, that they had it in the Bible, but that's how it is. You really don't ever get over it.
Well, they're walking into a country that they never been before. They don't know who they're going to meet there or live with. So they were giving at least one situation that may work. But everything actually in the Ten Commandments, we cannot say that everybody followed to the T. But this was a suggestion, a plan that it was like a wishful thinking, but not everything that was in the Ten Commandments is really being followed today either, to the T. Whoever wants to follow it, whoever is if you are a person who is not fitting to live within society, it's not for them. Or they want a certain kind of society, so it's not for them. And that's how it goes.
Yeah, and my impression of this text is that this is sort of, the world that God is trying to create.
Exactly.
This world, right, where, there is this kind of mutual sense of responsibility, a world where an accidental killer is both protected and an avenger, based on the culture, can actually pursue somebody who killed a family member, and so like both can do the natural thing for both of them. And to me it seems like, right, God is trying to almost find what feels like this compromise between both, and like a protection in some ways for both.
Okay.
Okay, any other reactions to this text before we dive a little bit deeper into one of the other pieces? Okay, this was brought up before, but I'm thinking about the high priest a lot, again, because Yom Kippur is coming, and of course, the high priest has this major, major role on Yom Kippur. I think the piece about the high priest here, that the accidental killer remains in the city of refuge until the high priest dies, I think is so, to me, like strikes me as random, and really, really fascinating. And also the way that a spiritual religious leader is then brought into society in this way, and like just norms around the way that we live together, and laws and trials and all of that, I think is very interesting. So we're going to look at a few texts that deal with that question. The first, can everyone see source 2? Okay, the first is from Rashi, who's one of our most famous and prolific commentators, from 11th century France. So he is commenting on that verse that talks about the connection between the death of the high priest and the accidental killer, and trying to figure out like what is the link between these two and how do we make sense of that. So Rashi says that the link is because the high priest should have prayed so that this curse, the accidental murder, wouldn't have happened to Israel in his lifetime. I see David shaking his head. I see Meryl shaking her head. Do we blame the high priest for what's happening? Do we agree with Rashi?
I don't think you can judge how a person is praying, or you don't know. Not everybody prays publicly. That's why I'm shaking my head when I read this. I'm like, if I'm praying, whether I'm in a synagogue during services or at home on my own and I'm totally alone, nobody's going to know exactly what I'm doing. I don't think that anybody's watching me in my house.
Right.
God
and that's
might be.
Yeah. But that's a question that I have about, like, if I could ask Rashi, I have a lot of questions for Rashi. If I could ask Rashi a question about this, I would ask, like, how do you know? How do you know that the high priest didn't pray so that this wouldn't happen? Like, maybe the high priest prayed. We all have experience of praying for things that don't work out. Maybe
Exactly.
he did. Okay. Other reactions to Rashi. Jonathan.
Well, yeah, I can't get into it either because it looks like this is it's prescriptive for posterity. So, which high priest is he talking about? Like, there's going to be one high priest, another high priest, generation after generation that all of these things happen. Should do in every case all the high priests don't do their praying? It doesn't make any sense, really. It seems like Rashi is thinking about the one particular high priest when the law was written, or whatever particular cases may have been on the table when it was written, but that type of answer cannot apply to general situations with every high priest and every killer and every avenger in every city. You can't say, oh, well, this happens every single time. It makes no sense.
Right. So is it possible that, either Rashi was thinking about one high priest specifically, or is it that every high priest in every situation doesn't pray hard enough? And that's why this keeps happening.
Yeah.
And if so, yeah, like, what does that mean? That has a lot of implications about prayer and the role of the high priest and the prayer of the high priest. Yeah, other reactions to this. Pnina.
I do not like if questions. Whenever my kids used to tell me, what if? I said, I do not like if questions. This is it. Wherever there is a situation where it's say if, then, and it didn't happen yet, I don't know if the solution that they are giving is going to fit of really what happened. So this is a very if thing, like if it happens that you killed, and if you did, it looks like they really didn't yet practice it or really saw the results. So I have no more comments about that.
Yeah, so if you really prayed hard enough, this wouldn't have happened.
Right,
Yeah, Benjamin.
like if, right.
I'm not sure I understand. How could the high priest pray for something that hasn't happened? So the way I'm reading it is, this John Smith is going to murder somebody. Well, how could the high priest say, oh, dear God, don't let John Smith do this action?
Right.
I mean, the high priest might say, let there be tranquility and let people get along.
Yeah.
But, and they may do that anyway, but it just seems so precise. It reminds me of when the big football game is going on and the fans are all praying for the team to score a touchdown. How does that really influence the game?
Right.
I
put it together with the pillar of smoke and fire and all this stuff that's like happening when they were going, and those things were supposed to lead them the way. I think it's a language that there was maybe a hopeful thinking, and maybe they didn't even have a city yet to try it out on. They're still in the desert. So, like I said, I think it was wishful thinking, very naive. That's all.
Yeah, these systems don't exist yet, but Benjamin, like what you were saying about, praying for something that hasn't happened yet, there's a long discussion in the Talmud about what things you can and cannot pray for. And like there is this big question of, can you pray for like something specific like that's in the future and that like you have no control over? And what if that thing has already happened, but you've prayed for a different result? And so there are all these debates back and forth about like what kinds of prayers. But it's interesting because it doesn't talk about like how those prayers are answered. And here it seems to be that there's so much blame placed on the high priest that like he didn't pray hard enough, and a lot of responsibility assigned to the high priest. And I'm also wondering, like, is there any responsibility to God here too, based on where the high priest prayers are directed?
Okay.
Oh yeah. Sorry, was somebody going to say something? One of the other things I think is interesting about Rashi in this commentary is that he's making a statement about the responsibility of leadership in this moment.
That's it.
This is like he had a few different commentaries on this particular verse, many commentaries on this parsha, but none of the commentaries on this piece really focused on the responsibility of the judges, for example, of the person who would be standing trial, and instead really focused on the high priest, which I also think is an interesting focus and goes back to what we were talking about before that David brought up of we have this situation that, we think of as being handled in, a court of law and in a trial and between people. And then Rashi is bringing in and saying, like, actually our spiritual leadership and our leadership as a people has a lot to do with this moment. And I just think that's an interesting piece of it too, that it's not just a judicial leadership question, but it's also a question of spiritual leadership amongst the people and religious leadership. Yeah, Pnina, and then Susan, and then David. Oh wait, Pnina, you are muted. Pnina, you're muted. Pnina, we can't hear you right now.
Okay, here we go. What did I do? Okay. So I think they didn't have the judicial system yet, the way we have it, or the way that Moses' father-in-law suggested. They are still traveling here. They are about to enter the land. And yet they need to some kind of authority. So if they fall of something that they knew before, like before, while the idol worshiping and all this, they always have those priests and people who were like telling them what's going to happen and stuff like that. So they're trying to come up with some kind of solution that fits the mold that they came up from before they go in and before they have the judges and the whole judicial system, the way Moses put it together. So this is why I say it was a naive suggestion. But we don't know. Does this give us really any examples of some situations that it worked or didn't work? No, it was just a suggestion. We don't even have a story that tells us that something like this really happened in one of those cities.
Right. This piece is just introducing that this is what is going to be happening. All right, Susan, and then David.
I'm not sure I agree with this. But the next one you have that by a Barbanel.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes some sense that he was a great authority, and he was the holiest one. And his death, people would be so shaken up that here he says that the living person would think about how short life would be. And so I'm going ahead to this one, but it's also, as Chaim said, I was just reading it now, that he was beloved, the high priest was beloved by the people. And then when seen as a leader, and when the high priest dies, they're so shaken about it, they won't be so wrapped up in mourning about their own relative. They'll mourn the priest. And one thing that I'll share this with you because it struck me now that's Chaim. Just as the high priest brings atonement for all Israel through the rituals of Yom Kippur, and that's what you started talking about, his death brings atonement for the inadvertent manslayer. Now, I'm not sure how his death, how that works, but it also seems to, he takes the sins of the manslaughter upon himself. And if that's the case, that also leads to Jesus in the future.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I know, it
tell
sounds
me what
similar.
you think of that.
Yeah, I agree that that does sound, I agree that like it sounded Christian while you were reading it. And it's an interesting idea specifically as it's related to the high priest. Like, I don't think the Eitz Chaim, does it give a citation there for where the text proof is for that idea? Do you see a citation, Susan, in the Eitz Chaim for that idea?
Yeah, that's it. It is that these are relayed in Etz Chaim for this particular passage.
Okay,
Until
I'm
the
grabbing
death
my
of
Eitz Chaim
Christ.
also.
Okay, it's on page 964.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious if it gives a text for that, what that text is in the context of that.
It doesn't give a source like
It doesn't give a
Rashi or
source. Oh, that's interesting.
Rambam.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, but like specifically because it's related to the high priest role on Yom Kippur. And I mean, we do have the concept like that it is the responsibility of the high priest on Yom Kippur to offer the sacrifices on behalf of the entire people. And so his performance on Yom Kippur actually does impact everybody else. But the idea that his death atones, I agree, is what sounds Christian here. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to look more into that and see if I can find a proof text for it. I'm just curious, like where they got that. Yeah. And David, what were you going to say?
Oh, I think the conversation has moved very interestingly past whatever I was going to say. So.
Okay. Okay, so let's move to the third text, to Abarbanel, who had a very interesting life. Very prominent in Spain, and had to leave because of anti-Semitism. Eventually wound up in Italy. And so Susan started to read this text by him. But I think this really brings a new dimension to this idea of the high priest. So I want to look at it together. He says, because the high priest was a great authority in Israel and holy to God, and that's where he's saying, this connection between the death of the high priest and the accidental killer being able to leave the city of refuge safely. With his death, the death of the high priest, all the people would be shaken up. Each living person would think about how short life is, and this would make people give up the idea of taking revenge for a family member's blood. Okay. What does Abarbanel see as the role of a leader, as the role of a high priest in people's lives? Yeah, David and then Penina.
Well, in some sense, it's leading the people to a higher concept of their life and existence. And because what I was actually going to say before was all of these dualities in this passage as we're talking today make theology part of justice and justice part of theology. For the Israelites, they're inseparable. And this is just a heightened instance of that inseparableness.
Yes. And we think about God as, the ultimate judge. And here there's also like another aspect of justice, like the high priest has a role in justice too. And like the way those are linked are so interesting. Nina. Oh, no, we can't hear you. Can you unmute?
Okay. Abarbanel was a product of he ran away from the Inquisition. So the kings were murdered. The Jews were expelled before. Isabella and Ferdinand were murdered. He was actually in charge of their money. And when a new king rose up, he ran for his life. And he was not a rabbi, but he was a very wise man, and we call them today Talmudic scholars. He settled in Italy, and because he ran away when the new king, and then there was a situation where 700 Jews were kidnapped for ransom. So he's not a rabbi, and he's not a Cohen, or I don't know if he was a Cohen or whatever, but he put together all the people of the community that survived and had money somehow put away, and they collected enough money to get those people out back alive. So the whole thing was happening without having a rabbi around or a king around that would tell him to do that, but they took upon themselves the responsibility he did to make sure that he saves his own people. So I think it all depends on the era of when this thing was written and what was available to them and what was not, and what was the capability of them actually achieving this law. Or did they even have a city yet? They didn't even have cities yet. They're still in the desert. So what I'm trying to say is, like, a lot of things, it's like wishful thinking or telling the people to appease them and to kind of like let them be more open to the laws, that there are maybe possibilities of solving those problems. And sometimes those problems could be maybe solved, and maybe sometimes they cannot. So like I said, here he was telling you all these things, but he himself had to make a decision, and he was not a rabbi, to go and save these people and collect money for his own people, to save those 700 people. And it really happened. So
and I think,
what I'm trying to tell you is a lot of things we have that was a wishful thinking.
And I think
sometimes they worked and sometimes they're not, because they're still in a tryout situation.
And I think Abarbanel here is also imagining what the Israelites were probably thinking and feeling, what their relationship to the high priest.
They do need a leader. He became the leader.
He had experience as a leader, and he as a leader can relate to that and can imagine, what happens when the person who is responsible for atonement for the entire community, who is responsible for the connection between the community and God. The high priest was the only one who could go into the Holy of Holies, having that physical proximity that was envisioned in the ancient world of the Israelites with God. And he's thinking about, like, in this, I guess, in some ways, idealized sense of a high priest, he's somebody who people feel very close to, like Susan, like you were saying.
Exactly.
He's someone who, if he died, it changes everybody. And people feel this connection to him. And I think this is such a beautiful idea of, who we are as Jews when we are leaders. We are people, we are leaders who build strong connections with one another, so that if, God forbid, something were to happen, people are shaken up because they really felt something, because they really felt connected in some way. Benjamin.
Thank you, Rabbi. And not to trivialize this important section, but I'm just thinking myself when John Lennon was assassinated, and it really affected me. I mean, I didn't know him other than as a fan, but it was powerful. Or JFK. So there's something to this.
I think so too. And I mean, and that piece also about like thinking about how short life is, especially when somebody or somebody like you admire even from afar dies. I think there is a perspective on life that happens, even maybe it's momentary and maybe it lasts a very long time, but something that just reminds us of our own mortality. And I think here it's also like in some ways another idealized sense of when that happens, people will turn themselves for the better and turn themselves in a way of forgiveness instead of towards revenge. And so I also think that that's a beautiful concept too, that our own recognition of life makes us want to live in a way that is channeled for good.
Unfortunately, there are certain things that cannot be forgiven. They
Yes.
just cannot. Because if you forgive it, it's going to tell other people that it's okay to do it.
Yeah, and here I think this is like less about forgiveness and on, acting upon those feelings of revenge or a sense of obligation for revenge.
If it's a mistake, if it didn't mean to do it.
If it's a mistake. Yes, only if it's unintentional. Yeah, Meryl.
I think it's about moving on. I mean, we had a relative pass away short time ago, who created some major family problems throughout the whole family. And when he passed away, some people were relieved that the torture that he created was over. Others felt bad for his daughter, who is now all alone. And the rest of the family said, okay, we can move on now. He's not in our way. And I think that's a maturity thing as to how you handle it, whether it's family, whether it's a dignitary, no matter who it is, you develop different philosophies towards how to move on.
And it channels your actions, like potentially in different ways also. And I think that feels very poignant in terms of Matot-Masei's placement at the very end of the book of Numbers. And there are some biblical scholars who see Genesis through Numbers and say, that should have been the Torah. Those are the 4 books that tell the entire journey of the Israelites. Deuteronomy is a separate Moses' retelling. Actually, it makes much more sense to have Genesis through Numbers. And I think that would make sense here in terms of this as a closing of, this is one of the last mitzvot, this is one of the last commandments to be given while the Israelites are still in the wilderness. And in some ways, it's about how to move on and how to move forward and what the connections in society and the dynamics are like. So I just want to quickly look at 2 more quick sources and then we'll wrap up. Source number 4 is from the Talmud, which I think just like brings a different perspective into it. So people were saying, well, wouldn't people want to just assassinate the high priest? Like, wouldn't everyone in exile, it would only make sense that they would want the high priest to die. So the rabbi said, well, okay, this is what happened. The mothers of the high priest used to provide clothing for the manslayers so that they should not pray for their sons' deaths. And I think this text is so interesting that the way that the rabbis, envision the entirety of society, like thinking of the high priest mothers in this moment is so beautiful, instead of just focusing on the priests themselves or like the killer and the victim and the extended families, but like who are all the people who could be impacted by one thing? And even the mother of the high priest is impacted by this. And even she contributes to this, and she's a part of this, and she feels something too. And then the last source I want to look at is from Maimonides, from the Mishnah Torah, from his Code of Law. He says, when a killer returns to his city after the death of the high priest, he's considered to be an ordinary citizen. If the blood redeemer slays him, the blood redeemer should be executed, for the killer has already gained atonement through exile. And here we're back to this idea of atonement and the different journey that a person can go on towards finding atonement in various situations. And so the question I want to close with, and I'd love to hear a couple thoughts before we say Shabbat Shalom and end our time together today. Why do you think this is the last mitzvah, the last commandment to be given on the banks of the Jordan River at the end of the book of Numbers? Why is this what we're closing with? Meryl.
A reminder of how to behave before you move on.
Nice.
I'm guessing, but that seems to me to be the most logical.
We're all guessing. We're all guessing. Yeah. How do we behave before we move on? And what does that say about how we're going to behave when we move on, when we cross the river, when we enter the land? Susan.
Well, that makes sense. Although I see we end of Masai, which comes after the Matot, but it's the daughters of Zelophehad that are in there. But this still is a good one because we know that there are going to be disagreements and disputes and fights and even lethal fights between people over things. And this is like a forgiveness kind of a statement that revenge shouldn't be poisoning the blood of those who want the revenge, and revenge shouldn't be poisoning the people. However, that being said, there still is the element of justice, and that but these are for involuntary murderers, not for those who plan a murder or do it deliberately, which is a different story.
Correct. A very different story. Yeah, David.
I can't come to the end of this without referring back to a prior part of this Parshat, arguably the nastiest passage in the whole Torah, which is about killing the Midianite women. And I wish could you discuss the sequencing? Because you go from something that we all disavow to something that we all embrace. And it's a really interesting, larger piece of sequencing here.
Yeah, and I think like that is part of the whole journey, and I'm just like conscious of time, and I want Penina to be able to speak too, so I apologize for doing this on one foot. But I think that we saw bloodshed and blood polluting a land. It's not the land that we will be entering, but I think it is that same idea of shedding blood intentionally as polluting the land. And so now, as we're about to enter the land, God is saying to the people, we as a people have moral standards, and to be in relationship with me, you need to abide by that and recognize that blood does pollute the land, and you are about to enter the land. And so I think in some ways this is a direct response to what happened. Penina, very quickly, and then we'll close it out together. Oh wait, Penina, you're muted. Oh no, okay, Penina, you're muted.
Okay, now it's okay now?
Yes. Okay, quickly, and then we'll close.
I said really quickly, Moses just died. Before they entered, and he didn't get to enter. So now they really don't have a leader. So I think the need to show that there is somebody who's going to be there to take a place of a leader was very important. And the only ones that they can think of at that particular moment, as close to God as a Kohen Gadol could be, next to after Moses. And that's why they did all this to I think punctuate the importance of having the rabbi, the priest or the high priest as a leader also, because there is no leader there now. He died. That's it.
Right.
That's
and Joshua is coming, but of course he doesn't have the
yeah,
same
but he was
standing as
he was more
Moses.
like a general, like a war
Yes. Right.
leader. Yeah,
Yes.
but not really spiritual.
Right. It's a
Or with
very
a direct
different
connection to God like Moses was.
Yes, it's a very different relationship. And I think for me, that's one of the big things that I'm thinking about as we close out the book of Bamidbar, as we close out the book of Numbers, is that we have this whole discussion about these relationships between people and different ways of protecting people and granting people their rights. And that in our society, in a Jewish society, we are also thinking about something beyond just ourselves, something beyond just people. We're thinking about God and we're thinking about the land. And I know, my thoughts and my heart are in Israel right now. I know most, not all of ours are. And so I'm thinking about, just being on the banks about to enter the land. And this Parsha for me really highlighting the land itself and the relationships between people and God, and how the land plays such an important piece of that. And going back to, what Benjamin was saying at the beginning of polluting the land and the land having its own real identity as this living being that we are also in relationship with. And I also love the way that the rabbis bring in so many different people and so many different emotions and feelings around this whole concept, that in some ways the idea of the city of refuge and the high priest is a way of thinking about, how the rabbis view text and law more generally. The different webs of connections and relationships that come from that. And so my hope for all of us as we enter into Shabbat this week is thinking holistically about the different things in our own lives, thinking about how we are moving forward, what we are on the cusp of right now as we enter Shabbat. So I want to thank everybody for a wonderful discussion today. I'm excited to be with you all again in a few weeks, and I'm wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye.